say anything more about Shell. It's the, it's at least the short-term future for us. You look way down in the future, and probably the whole bay will be aquaculture, but at least for the near future, we have to have Shell to continue. The one thing that we're interested in doing now is that actually, and if it helps with some of the lobbying to get it going in Maryland again, working with the contractor to actually come up with systems to make that shell available to private leases too, because we used to buy all the shuck shell, and as aquaculture has grown, we in the state have kind of backed out of that and try to let just market forces control prices there, because if we go in and try to bid for those and we bid up against our aquaculture industry, and we try not to do that. So, but at the same time, there's not enough house shelling enough for aquaculture to grow. So hopefully, if we can keep the shell dredger working, we will develop some strategies for making shell available to private industry out of that too. Maybe they just keep the machine going.
Jim, I have some questions along those lines in your shell dredge. How long have you been doing it at the current levels, or can you give a historical perspective how long you've been doing it?
Well, both states have been dredging shell for
I'm aware of
years and years. For Virginia, when you go back to the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, we were actually dredging shell for road beds, and the same kind of machines were working, and the state only got royalties of shell back for using on public beds, which, looking back, how much of a terrible waste of a resource that was. But can't you go back and get those now? But we have had the program. We used to actually buy our dredge shells after those quit from Maryland, and as they were dredging up here, they would take shells back to Virginia for some of our work. But we were mostly doing house shells. We just bought a little bit of dredge shell up here, and then around 2000, we got our own permit for these areas that we're working on now. So we've been working on these sites we're working on since 2000.
And what's the amount of shell you're taking in the last couple of years?
In the last couple of years, we are maybe 600,000 bushels, something like that, a year. And that's less than it had been, because if any of y'all have paid attention to this escalation in shell prices, one of the big problems we had is that the partners doing restoration got into competition with each other because of limited shell, and they were, people were coming out with these outrageous values for shell just to get their projects done, and pretty much the shell dredger as well as the houses decided that, if one person offers that much money for shell, then we should just set shell at that price. So we've gone from a shell price of overboard of around $1 bushel to this year almost $5 bushel for exactly the same shell, and that's been in less than 4 years. So I'm hoping that if we go to somebody else buys this dredge, and now that we in Virginia, we've kind of said, if you're doing sanctuaries, try to stay with alternative, leave the shell that's left for the industry, because it's the only thing the industry can harvest from. So if we stay on the route of sanctuaries being alternative and shell being for industry, then we can actually get the prices to go down if we produce a little bit more. So hopefully after the shell prices will go down.
No, follow up. I think you said you had about $2 million budgeted towards that program. And so first question, where's that come from? And then I know money and shell are both finite resources, of course, but from a shell perspective, how long do you anticipate the shell reserves to last if the money does exist?
Well, we've had our best years in our history. The past 3 years, we've had $2 million from our shell, so that have been, and that's 100% of that money went to shell, went to dredging fossil shell. They're already talking about budget cuts, so whether we'll be able to hold that or not. I mean, hopefully we will. I'm not sure we'll be able to go up much from that, even though we do have a lot of people lobbying for us to get more. Even with where we are, as the numbers have gone down, we're still returning about $5 to $7 back into the economy for every dollar we put into the shell to put overboard. So it's a good sell in the General Assembly. The question on how much is there is, it's definitely finite. We have an area that's probably about 500 acres right now that we can dredge in. That, if we really went really crazy dredging, it would go way faster. But at the levels we are now, or a little bit more, it's probably at least 20 years there.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's funny talking about shell. I remember back in the 70s and probably 80s, we used to send a trailer down from Connecticut every day to Langenfeller and take back a load of shells. In Connecticut, that was a big deal. Back in the day, when I've seen pictures, I certainly don't remember, although I'm pretty old. Everything was shucked, and we got a tremendous amount of shells. And the same way with Jersey, when I started, everything was shucked, and we got a tremendous amount of shells. And that was a commitment that the oystermen had. And saw some of Dave's graphs about how long it went, and then all of a sudden it stopped. And that's probably around the time that we switched over and started selling most of our product for the shell trade. And that's what's happened today, and we don't have that shell to put back. I think our whole shell budget this year, we put about 150,000 bushels over. We're very, very choosy about where we put that shell, and we put it in the water exactly when the spawn's in the water, give or take. We have a big sediment problem in Delaware Bay. Your water looks really clear when I come here and look at it compared to ours. So we can't leave that shell on the bottom very long, or it doesn't do any good. So we have to be really closely monitor when, try to, when we're going to have a good set and when we're going to have spawn in the water and put the shell in there. And our company, we built 3 100-foot boats, and you saw probably one of them pictures on Dave's slides, so we can actually go out and suck our shell back up off of our lease bottoms and dry it and put it back over in the summertime. That's the only oyster shell we have, and we have to use clamshell on our state bottom. So.
How well are your clam shells working?
Very well.
I really don't want to say.
Right.
Because maybe you'll take them all.
We've already used them.
Everybody says that, and even our watermen home say,
Well,
hey, you're throwing them away. You're just dumping them on the bottom. We're spending all our money.
I've already put 2,000
But-
bushels overboard. They're doing okay.
All I can say is my captains usually tell me when they're working on a shell planting area.
Yep, and every time
And I can walk in that packing room and I can see every single oyster go past with a jump clamshell on it. So don't tell me it don't do it.
every time we dredge up one, it's got a little piece of clam on it. I take it on into the bar and say, you tell me they won't catch it. It's all
Absolutely.
wild catch. It's not none of these go in the setting pots. It's all wild catch.
And that's all we've been able to use in Jersey is about that much every year, and we're going to catch around 100,000 bushel this year. And so, when they come to me and tell me about how we're wasting our money doing it, I just laugh at them. I say, well, you haven't been worked on none of them shell planting areas, I guess, because you ain't been paying much attention.
All right, well, I didn't mean to let your secret get out.
All right, so Bill, and then I'll get Johnny's next, and I'll get you next. Go ahead, Bill.
So I mentioned that in Washington State we have oyster reserves. So there is a small area, a 1,000-acre area on Willapa Bay that the state manages, where there's a natural catch of Pacific oysters that the industry can bid on and harvest those oysters. So that would be similar to public ground here in the Chesapeake. And in that situation, if they win a bid and do a harvest on those state oyster reserves, they're required as part of that bid to put shell back out in the area where they bid. That's just part of the deal. So. Then I also just wanted to comment, with the transition to the more and more single oysters, it's a one-way street for the shell. We're not shucking them anymore. anymore, so the oyster shells are going out to market.
And not coming back.
And I know in some cases here on the East Coast, you guys have been successful at getting some recycling programs going with the restaurants and collecting some of that shell and getting it back in the water. We've tried to do that in Washington State, and our Department of Fish and Wildlife is not going to allow it because they're concerned about disease issues. So we got live oysters coming in from all around the world into oyster bars in the markets in Seattle, and they're concerned that they're bringing disease in from other areas of the world, so they don't want that shell going back out in the water. So we can't get a recycling program going in Washington State anyhow because of that.
All right, Johnny?
Hey, this is a question for Bill. Bill, you had shown in your talk your two upwelling sites, one down in Shelton and the other one up in California, and had showed a small example of how you actually set larvae on what we call here microcots. At any rate, if you could give the audience some idea of how many bushels of shell would the amount of microcots that you actually use per year equate to, and its consistency as you use it.
Well, Johnny, I don't have the numbers on it. You know, we used to crush our own shell and sieve our own shell, and I think now we buy it. You know, I think it's mined shell. We buy bags of shell flour that we use at the.
That's what I wanted to ask about, that was my next question. What's the line for?
Yeah, we get bags of shell flour in that we use now.
But at any rate, you're setting millions of animals on just small numbers of
Small
shell.
fraction of shell.
Yeah.
Exactly, and as I pointed out with those coupels from France, we would eliminate our use of shell altogether.
Exactly. And if you could give us an idea, how many oysters do you actually produce out of those two sites per year? Out of those two Flupsy sites?
Good question. Probably, I don't know, maybe 100 million oysters, something like that.
Okay, 100 million divided by 3 would be a lot of oysters. Okay, and then that would, in return, would produce how much shell per year back into the state of Maryland? So now then, not only are we producing shell and meat and building an industry, we've solved the problem of the shell shortage. That's all, and that's my comment.
We actually, in Canada, we shuck more oysters for our processing facility. And we don't have seed setting facilities at that site, so the shell is actually a waste product for us up there that we've had to go to landfill with. And they pay us, we have to pay by volume to go to landfill, so it's very expensive for us to get rid of our shell. So we just, in the last month, we just put a shell crusher at that site to start reducing the volume of the shell. And then we're looking at alternative products. We're making, fertilizer, gardening supplements and so on. We're looking at making byproducts with that shell because we don't have a market for it.
He's already answered. Thank you.
Then you're up.
Yeah, comment, we hear how important the seed areas are in Virginia. And when we had our shell program here in Maryland, we had Back Cove, which is one of the largest seed areas. What's recently happened to us, and I've heard nobody talk about this, one of our best seed areas we had was Harris Creek and the Little Chop Tank River. Well, the federal government has found that they've dumped about 40-some odd million dollars into these areas to the point where, and this is a fact, is where there is federal money invested, there can be no carbon footprint of anybody doing anything with those oysters ever again. So we've taken our best seed areas and have turned them,
This until after the fact.
yeah, and have turned them into these sanctuaries. Now, I mean, we hear people say that sanctuaries don't mean to be worked, but then we hear people that have spent millions of dollars doing research said that they only last 4 years. We're 6 years into our sanctuaries, people, in Maryland right now. Maryland DNR has absolutely squat for a management plan. They've handed that over to the Oyster Advisory Committee and to the watermen. That's not our job. It is our job to come up with the ideas, but it was their job to initially do this, to hand us a management plan. All due respect to Mr. Judy, he was not involved with it during that time. He's not in the position he was now, so I can't blame Chris for this. But what I'm hearing is that, number one, we're losing seed areas here in Maryland. Number two, we have no seed and shell program. Then when we get an area that we need to dredge shell for, we have certain groups that are objecting to it. And I've heard Mr. Wesson say, and correct me if I'm wrong, one of our major problems and why we had our shell program deterred was that certain individual groups that were involved with fishing and recreational fishing said that these areas created such a harmful plume, it was affecting the spawning of the striped bass, and that these areas were not helpful in the fishing. Well, I've heard from Mr. Wesson, your people in Virginia love it. Am I correct? That they love it. They love these dredged areas because the way this dredge does work. So once again, here we go again, where we need to work together. You've got to stop making it look like everything the watermen do in this state, from harvesting oysters to working sanctuaries, that we're the enemy, when nobody has another plan. Nobody. I've sat in every oyster advisory committee that this state has had, and I have not heard a single person that is against anything come up with a plan. The watermen are come up with a plan. So, I mean, I'm just making this comment that if you're worried about what the problem is, we're seeing these gentlemen sitting up here today, and they've got everybody working with them. We have in Maryland here, it's like a covey of quail someone slapped their foot in the middle of. They've gone in 90 different directions, like trying to herd cats, and it doesn't happen. So bottom line is, our biggest thing, what we can say is everybody's got to get on the same page. I mean, we want oysters in the bay, correct. We want a viable industry, correct. Stop this finger pointing, because don't forget, you point one finger, you got three pointing back at you.
Yeah, I'm a waterman, been a waterman for 40 years. And really, it was, my problems with aquaculture was basically about the way it was presented to us. It was basically said, this is what you're going to do. And it's kind of hard to tell a waterman who's done something for 35 years, that this is what you're going to do. And that's basically how it got started. Now, I'm also on the Oyster Shell Committee in Tulsa County, have been for 30 years. And like Rob Newberry said, I mean, I'm also on the Tulsa County Waterman Association, I'm the secretary. And I wrote a position paper about where we stood when Maryland put their management plan in, which was the 25% sanctuaries. And it basically was that we stood by our shell replenishment program. It had been good since the 60s, and that we didn't want to increase power dredging because it would spread us out a little bit. But we also wanted to try to bring some oysters out of Virginia, which seemed to have a tolerance to some of the diseases that we have here, and bring them up here, just the way that in the past the shell replenishment program kind of spread the disease from the lower bay to the upper bay. But we thought maybe we could spread some of this resistance to the disease. And also how the two states that are here, Delaware or New Jersey, and kind of implemented our program by the shell replenishment using the fossil shell. So basically that's a waterman, that's where I stood. It's like, you know, this is what we believe in, and yet you're trying to shove this down our throat. Now since then, I've looked at aquaculture a little bit differently. And, you know, my wife here, she says if we continue to oyster, it might be something that I might have to do. That said, it's still, as the average age of the waterman in this state is around 50 years old. And like I say, I've done it for 40 years, and it sounds like a lot of work to me. So it was another reason that I thought that the watermen were kind of against aquaculture, because we're basically all older, and it is a lot of work. So that's kind of where I stood.
Yeah, Jim, you mentioned briefly, which I think bears underscoring here, that in the sanctuary areas in Virginia, which are associated with all of the rotational harvest areas, I believe you told us the other night, that now, after what you just described in terms of the competition driving up the cost for the shell, you're now using all alternative substrate in those sanctuary areas. So you are doing restoration, but you're putting substrate down in the sanctuary areas, but you're not using the oyster shell, you're using alternative substrates. Can you tell us a little more about that?
That is true. I mean, and just not to leave his question, I mean, this age difference between public fishery and aquaculture is real. I mean, and that's why, at least for the near term, you know, we can't get rid of the public fishery because we have an aging group that is not going to transition. But when you look at aquaculture in Virginia as it's growing, the younger people are the ones that are moving into aquaculture. That's the growth industry. And if somebody wants to start in oysters now, they looked at that first, just like we've seen that happen in our clam aquaculture industry. We're not talking about that at all, about how big that industry is in Virginia. But as far as the dichotomy on the shell, I mean, and sanctuaries, it's just that we saw this shortage of shell coming, and so we basically worked with our partners and asked that they stop using our shell. And that's caused some problems for us in the short term because our shell with our partners was used as the match. So we didn't have to have any cash match. We actually matched with shell for a lot of the early projects that we did with core. And since that time, we have, by going to an alternative material for the sanctuaries, that's caused us a little bit of hiccup in actually getting some of the work done with the core because we don't have cash match. Virginia is very limited on funds in the state. It always has been limited on funds for oysters, and so we've had to be very careful on how we use what we have. And we're to the point now where even on all of our shell stuff, I mean, with $2 million, and as far as shells go, we monitor all the harvest areas in the state, and we monitor for both live oysters and for culture. And we have a threshold that if a bar gets below a certain threshold of shell, it goes into the group that needs to be reshelled, and it's according to how bad it is and how high it rises. But we're losing ground every year because we are, like this past year, we had 1,500 acres of our harvest areas and sanctuaries that needed shell, and we only had enough money to do 500. So we're losing both because the price of shell's gotten so much, even though we have the highest amount of money we've ever had, and even though we are not doing any new areas in Virginia with shell at all. And we just cannot afford, if we can't keep them up, since we know they're going to disappear over time, we don't want to commit them, we want to take care of what we have. The new areas that are being built with the federal funds in sanctuaries, not in harvest areas.
So what substrates are you using, and do they grow oysters in fact?
Everything grows oysters. I mean, if it's hard, I mean, golf balls, anything, toilets, concrete, granite, they all do equally well. As long as you put them there and they're clean, they're put out right down the year, they all do adequate as far as getting the oyster population. But like the pictures I showed, in Virginia, we have a lot of things that foul. And so once you get oysters attached to concrete and you get everywhere else taken up with the fouling community, like red sponge and tunicates and everything else as you see, they don't go beyond where they were that first time you put an old board, because the shell I've gone into the shell budget and everywhere else has been occupied by other creatures. So all these things, you get that one pop the first year you put an old board, but from then on, you're fighting with whatever Mother Nature happens to put out there, whether it's an oyster or something else, and you're into all these other processes. And so if you want to make that sanctuary look good again, you have to go back and recover with new stuff, because it'll.
Or work it.
Huh?
Or work it.
No, you can't work this. You can't work these rocks. I mean, you're stuck with them. When you do the rocks, you're stuck with rocks forever. So you have to go back with them with even more rocks. So.
Anybody have science for
No, and just hearing about the clamshell, that was a funny thing, but the shell budget is something else. The shell from the federal government is something else, and that's why we're managing ours on a measly $150,000 1,000 bushel because we've never agreed to do any sanctuaries. And I guess, I always figured that you're not managing your fishery if you got a sanctuary, because you don't have to manage that. All you gotta do is just sit there and watch it. So, but anyway, that's, you know, and I think it all needs to be managed, all of it. And I don't believe in sanctuaries. I think even if you have that bottom, and it only opens up for a little while, and it gets worked, everything needs working. The whole bottom needs working. And that's my opinion of that. And I claim the more the clean bottom you have, and the more you turn your bottom over, the better set you're going to have. So that's what we've done in New Jersey with what little bit we've had. And I guess Chesapeake's got all the money, what it sounds, because we want to agree with sanctuary.
I'd like to say something about alternative material. In 2010, when I first took office, we had that's when they took up the sanctuaries and took the little chop tank in Dorchester, which was our best seed ground. They brought Florida shell, which was supposedly fossilized. Our wonderful governor spent about $6 million and had CSX transported up out of Florida, and it's sitting, most of it's still sitting in Dundalk on train cars. Anyway, this created quite a plume when this stuff was put over. The fine count on it was checked, and it was way off the charts. And all of a sudden, they get the declaration of it changed, that it's no longer fossilized, it's stone. So you're also changing the topography of the river bottom when you put this alternative substrate down. Then, i.e., as Mr. Weston said, you can't work this stuff anymore. So, you know, it all goes back to the point we need natural shell. And unfortunately, from an agricultural standpoint, back in the 40s, again, the government got their hand into it, and the Department of Agriculture says, hey, by the way, especially along the East Coast, if you have shell mittens, which were Native American trash piles, basically, where they brought the oysters out of the river, shucked them, and ate them, and just put the shell in piles. Dig those piles up, pulverize them, now you've got lime to change the pH count in your soil. Or the shucking houses, back in the 30s and the 40s, because there was such a huge amount of oysters, the shells were used to create infrastructure, i.e. roads. So here we are, we've depleted our shell. And again, you know, we have a chance here in Maryland to get back on a seed on shell program with man of war, but there's still a lot of roadblocks, especially through the environmental groups that want to block this.
Can I just say one thing, just for this whole man of war thing, just to let you know, that is 100 million bushels of shell. 100 million bushels of shell is what they estimate at man of wars that can be excavated and not affect the bar itself. That's only doing about 9.5 acres, so 100 million bushels.
And that's coming from where?
Man of war shoals.
Which is?
Off of the mouth of the Patapsco River, and it is a non-productive oyster bar. There's been no recorded catch on it since 2008.
I have a sort of a two-part question in terms of some of the opposition to the native shell dredging. I guess there are people that oppose it for various reasons, but I think that if there's still a question of where the shell comes, we're going to need some source. I guess some alternative strategies have been the alternative substrate, and the second is bringing non-native shell from elsewhere. I guess my question is, with the substrate, obviously the permanence of it, certain things have been done where a bridge has been taken down and put in the water somewhere. What are the risks with that in terms of how it changes the topography of the bottom and how tidal flows? You know, what are the risks of that? And then also, as far as, you know, I know like there's a place in Mexico that has shell deposits that may be for sale, and some people propose that. How high do you think the risk is of bringing in a non-native shell in terms of introducing alien, introducing an alien species into this ecosystem, and you know, whatever may be hanging on to it, even once it's cleaned? What are the risks associated with those two strategies?
All right, which one of y'all want to take the question?
I mean, that's not, to me, it's not a very hard question. It's just so prohibitively expensive that it's almost like a non-starter. I mean, those things that are down there, like that one in the Gulf of Mexico, most of those ships are up on land from previous dredging projects. So they're not gonna bring anything with them, but it's just, when you compare that transportation cost versus some dredging something in your backyard, that's not even, they're not even comparable. I mean, that's only for some of these, projects that there's a big budget for, you need to get them done, but you can't build an industry or build a aquaculture industry on an expensive product like that. So, it's something we should think about, I don't think.
Either on the bottom topography or on bringing in or importing shell in Maryland.
Hey, Jim, to continue that conversation, what is the time limit on getting, say, Maryland on board to buy enough shell to keep the dredge going? Or have we run out of time? Because nothing is simple, you know?
No, it's not that simple, but it's, I mean, we actually met with the people that are interested in buying it, or one of the people that are interested in buying it, on Friday with, you know, I don't think in the short term that it'll be an issue because they know we have a project, but in the long term, because this dredge has not been maintained as it should have been over the past 10 years because it hadn't had enough work, they would certainly be more inclined to make improvements on it. And I mean, the way it's set up right now, the dredge has been, when it was working for Virginia and Maryland and had these big contracts, they kept extras of every part on board because they understood the fact that if you did do the shell planting from June to September, you were wasting your time. And so if they had a breakdown, there would be no issue. For now, those old spare parts have been scavenged. And so if there's a breakdown on it, you know, you can 2 to 3 weeks waiting for some special part to be made, which would make the success go down for either state. So it's really important to, at least for the short term, to consider keeping this thing in business while we make the decision for the long term for oyster restoration.
I was going to say, because we have to look at sustainability here too. So even if this is a solution in the short term.
No, this is a solution for the short term. This is to keep us going while we make these broader decisions on the long term production of oysters.
It used to be about $1 million a year for Maryland. I don't have any idea where it ended up, but what would the cost now be?
What they used to do for $1 million would probably be $5 million.
I have a question for Dave. I think you said you do about 160,000 bushels of shell back, and your average harvest over the last period you put up was about 77,000 bushels. So you're looking at twice the amount of shell you have to put back to what you harvest. And I don't want to oversimplify it, but I think maybe you answered the question I was thinking is 2 to 1 payback. And I think that's the similar thing that Jim mentioned in Virginia with their seed program, is you have to bring 2 bushels to the state of shell in order to get the seed. In your case, you're putting back probably twice the amount of shell as what you're harvesting. Now, what is the comparison of the harvested product versus the shell when it comes to bushels? Is there a difference? You know, the live oyster versus just shell from a bushel to bushel ratio? How do you compare that?
I'm not exactly sure what you're asking. So,
well, I'm saying
how much shell is in a bushel of live oysters versus?
Yeah, how many live oysters are in a bushel of shucked shell? I think is the best way to say it. Because obviously it's a volumetric calculation, but it's a different geometry.
If you look at it, I don't know off the top of my head. What I can tell you is that, so first of all, recognize that we use a U.S. standard bushel, so our bushels are smaller than Maryland and smaller than Virginia bushels. And in our bushels, 264, 266, somewhere there is what an average number of oysters in a bushel that comes off the bed. So probably compresses to about a third of that, just a shell, roughly.
Yeah, I'm thinking of one of our issues in Maryland with shell, is we don't have shucking capability like we used to.
But what would be what's your cost for putting those shells overboard every year?
What's the cost?
Yeah.
It's about $2 a bushel, and we're actually not using oysters either. It's crushed clamshell.
So you're not using oyster at all?
So $320,000 is your investment every year?
Roughly, yeah.
And so 70,000 pounds, however many per bushel,
So usually it fluctuates. So right now it's $150,000. We got a 50,000 bushel supplement from the state. So with just the industry, it's going to be 100,000 bushels that we're going to get over. And their harvest this year was 88,000 bushels of this quota.
that was 40 or 50,000 bushel.
Times $2 a bushel.
Yeah, but how much would be the return on the dockside value of the oyster?
Oh, 47.50 is about what we're using for that.
So I mean, it's a big difference. The return on investment for a shell is very high, and that's the selling factor to like the general assembly, is that just what you're investing in the fishery and what comes out of the fishery, it's a very good return on dollar in and dollars out.
And that's only directly, that's not.
Yes, I want to maybe call in a question. There might be some differences in Maryland and Virginia waters with respect to putting the substrate out, and then you get a one-shot settlement deal, and then all the other fouling organisms get in there, so you don't really get much of a set. You can go around here to the Oyster Exhibit Museum and see descriptions of these oyster reefs in Maryland that went off quite a distance from the bottom, and the fact that you could dredge areas that have very thick layers of oysters did show, at least in this part of the bay, that oysters will grow vertically and set on each other. So for sanctuaries or public ground, this business of just kind of one shot and then the fouling community gets in there and you don't get any more set, I'm not sure it happens.
Well, it is though, because I mean, in all the fossils, you go to the James River, you go to any of these areas, all the 3D reefs are veneer. Because oysters, they make their own habitat, and they make their own coffins, because when one attaches on the other. And actually, the best culture of all culture.
Or back to wherever your packing house is to make sure that tag's there and how many tags you have and harvested.
But in comparison to Maryland, that would be 1,000 licenses limited at 80 bushel a license, wouldn't it?
That's correct.
And I don't think that would.
If the harvest was the same volume.
Yeah.
So that's a problem. Now, I don't know how you solve that problem, because if you have more licenses than can sustain themselves on whatever a limited quota is, then what happened here is some people have purchased multiple licenses. So somebody said, I can't afford, if my quota is going to go down by that much, I can't afford to run my business anymore, so I'm willing to sell my license. And so somebody else buys that license, and they put that license on their boat. Now they have two quotas, so they can get 2,000 bushels.
And what made this, it's terrible, but that's what's happened in the oyster business as long as I've been in it, probably forever. Bad things makes other things happen. And I know in 1991, when we still had bay season, I took all my boats up the bay and I planted 103,000 bushel. In that time, I had 103,000 bushel on my grounds. And by the 1st September, they was all gone. And so did everybody else. And that's what, and we would have never in this whole wide world ever been harvesting and managing our fishery probably in the scenario that we are now if that bad time hadn't happened. But that's the way it worked, and so back then all our fishery was big boats because everybody kept the big boats so they could do the bay season scenario and do transplanting and do whatever they needed to do on the grounds. Now our fishery's pretty much changed. There's a few of us that still got some big boats, but pretty much all our fisheries changed to little boats, because that's, the guys had to go that way to be able to, or to be able to still work. It seems like bad times is whatever, you know, like I say, and I've thought about that a lot. And, you know, there was other things. Now, back in the 70s, we had a bad spell, and that's when we limited the fishery. We closed it at 101 licenses, and that stood all these years. There's never been any more licenses issued, and it's a good thing with the quota we have. And you know, I can't say it's a bad thing. I've been through all these good times and bad times, and people always say, hey, you know, how's the oyster business? I said, well, compared to when? You know, because I can remember the day when I sent my boat out in the shucking house all winter long, caught 1,000 bushel. And that guy don't catch that one shot deal now with a boat. So I don't know. I don't know what's got to happen for. It's a tough thing. I'm on both sides of this with the council and being a waterman myself, and it's hard to convince everybody, you know, what's got to happen, and I don't know what the answer is. I mean, it's just like I said, bad times. It seems like that's what made all the things happen through the years, you know.
I was just gonna, I don't know if I did my calculations right, but that seems like in Delaware, if 81 licenses harvest 80,000 bushels and the quotas evenly allocated, and the bushels go for about $48 a bushel, that's about a $50,000 return per license. Is that annual?
Yeah, mid-40s now.
Something mid-40s. And I'm just wondering if, Mr. Porter, is that about what, I know in Virginia, some people don't fish all the time. People, the ones who are fishing full-time, is that about the return? I'm just trying to understand. I don't know if you want to answer that. You don't have to.
In Virginia, we're allowed 8 bushels per person. Per day. Per day. And then like October 1st, we can go to Rappahannock for a month. Then we go November 1st, we go to James River, we work there, then we come home to Pokémon Sign, we work in December, January, February. Now, like right now, we're on a 4-day work week until January 1st. We've been that, what, the last 2 years, Jennifer? We're on a 4-day work week. We catch 32 bushels a week apiece. That's if we're gonna break down, you know, and that's till December, that's till January 1st. After January 1st, we got January and February, we're done. We're done. And I think you got here, I think after this year, when I can hear about Maryland, I think you're gonna have to do something. I mean, is what I'm hearing true, that there are no oysters, or?
Slim.
I know the Pokémon Sign, the guys there, they came out with a patent tongue rig 2 days. I mean, 2 boats the first day, they've never been back. So, you know, but y'all's gonna have to do something. I don't know what the answer is. I mean, we're making it off of 8 bushels per man with the price of oysters now. I mean, we're not getting rich. We're keeping the wolf off our back, so, you know, what you have to do. That's it, you know. And like I said before, I know you may not agree with the sanctuaries, but you can rotate those rocks. I'll give you, for instance, one rock in the Pocomoke Sand, we stopped it for 1 year, okay? We had to go to a different area. On my way in, the last day of the season, which was the end of February, which I wasn't supposed to do, Jim probably won't like it, but I dropped a dredge on it to see what was on it. It's a solid dredge full of oysters. There were 3, 3 1/4, 2 3/4. From end of February until the first day of December, you would not believe how much those oysters grew. It was amazing. We went in there, big as my hand. Guys asked me what happened to all the little ones. I said, they grew up. I mean, you know, if you let that rock sit for a year, it's amazing what the benefit from it. I mean, you know, you guys dredging the same rocks every year, you're not going to make it. I I'm not an expert, but you're not gonna make it.
I had a question for all the states about the freshly shucked shell, if they had ever put that like straight back into the water from the packing house to the oyster bars to replenish them. Have you all ever done anything like that?
Well, most states require some period of curing process, so that any kind of remaining tissues are gone, if there's any dermal disease in there, something like that, will go away. And there's been very few studies done on how long that should be.
Isn't there like remaining spat on the oyster that could possibly still grow and the benthic organisms on the shell? That would be beneficial.
So there are.
If they were back in the water like within 24 to 48 hours.
That can be there. In New Jersey, most of that, if it's small spat, then it'll be there and you can't get rid of it. But if it's anything to be chipped off, it's supposed to sort of be culled off as best as possible. And there's a restriction on how much of that can be in a bushel when it's harvested. I forget the number, I want to say it's maybe 15% by volume or something like that. And that can go back. And in fact, a lot of people will take the stuff that comes off of there and put it back. Usually on a lease, doesn't have to go back onto the public grounds, but it'll go back into the water somehow. But anything out of the shucking house has to be cured, and all that stuff will be dead by the time it goes back.
And in Virginia, there are times that you have enough spat on the shell that some of the shucking houses put them right back over for it, take the meat out and
I
put
thought
it
that
back.
Bevins, doesn't he put it
Yeah.
right back out?
Yeah.
Right.
All right, we have time for maybe just a couple more. You have a question? I want to get this gentleman first.
Dr. Weston, you said the return on investment for the fossil shell program is 7 to 1. Just my question is, apart from that, have you done, has there been any larger study that explores, the benefit of, in terms of what kind of jobs it produces, in terms of not just the operation itself, but that 7 to 1, that's sort of a direct economic benefit, but then you have all the truck drivers, the shucking houses, the banks, the local restaurants.
Yeah, those figures are available. Karen's boss and her department, they've got those numbers. Was it 1.68? 1.68 back into the economy for every bushel that you get.
So I just wanted to ask John Bibiota, is there anything we're missing here that we haven't talked about that you think is an important idea? Not to put you on the spot or anything, but we've been talking a lot about public fishery, and in terms of the aquaculture industry, or just the resource as a whole. I just want to give us a chance to hear your thoughts before we close this.
I was going to get with Jeff after this talk, because you had mentioned about your age and the age of the average waterman, and I get you, right? But at the same time, I get how you've been oystering for so long and you don't really want to change, and I don't think that you should. But I wouldn't be against, doing what you currently do and possibly just dabbling a little bit in trying to raise a few oysters, just to see if it's something that you like or don't like. You're liable to find out it's something you absolutely hate. You're liable to find out it's not that bad, but you really don't know. And one of the things that I see that everybody does, down by us, as opposed to aquaculture, is they get caught up in the romantic side. I'm going to clean the dam, I'm going to do this, it's clean, and they figure I'm going to buy X number of oyster seed, and then I'll sell all of those for $1 a piece, it'll be great. And then they find out really what it's all about, and it's a whole different ballgame. And you're right, there's a lot of work involved in that. But most people buy more than they should to start out. That gets them in a place they really don't want to be because it's the gift that keeps giving. They keep growing, they keep taking more space, they keep demanding more gear. So if you're going to, dabble in it a little bit, do it on a small scale, find out what's happening, how you like it, and there are a fair amount of oyster growers aquaculture growers in the state of Virginia, and there's a fair amount that have gotten into it and have gotten out also. So, it's not right for everybody, and there is a lot more work than most people realize is involved. But if you found out and you did do it, and you found out that you liked it, you could slowly grow. I had 10 cages to start out with, and I had 30 cages, and I had 50 cages. I went that route. I didn't vet the house. So I kind of did it on a smaller scale, and then I got a little bit better. Then I had more than the house. So, that being said, I would, rule it out as a possibility.
Is there anybody who hasn't asked a question or made a comment that would like to in the audience? You're sitting there on your hands, just waiting for your moment. This is it. All right. Oh, you're just checking the time. Okay. Well, let's thank our panelists.
And let's thank Jeff for doing an excellent job on So I just want to let you all know what the follow-up from this will be. We are going to draft a small report of the ideas that came out of our speakers and this community discussion, and give that report to our stakeholders of the next Oyster Futures Work Group next 2 weeks. We will run that report by our speakers to make sure we don't